And Richard Rice, you have a particular concern from a particular individual you want to address.
Yes, let me take a running start at that by saying that I think one of the primary motivations for open theism, as John and John have indicated, is to be faithful to the biblical view of God, particularly in its description of God as dynamically involved in human experience, experiencing the events of the world as they happen and reacting resourcefully and creatively to the decisions and experiences that human beings go through. It seems to me that's the fundamental commitment of open theism. As a corollary of that, open theists maintain that God learns about what happens in the world to a significant degree from events as they happen. Now, what's interesting is that some of the reactions to open theism have affirmed the open theist commitment to a dynamic divine experience, but denied that God's knowledge of the world is dynamic. And I see that as a real disconnect. Let me just quote from a fairly recent book by Stephen Roy, who was a conversation partner of John's not long ago. Roy writes this in his book, How Much Does God Foreknow? He says, one of the great benefits of open theism is its insistence that we take seriously the widespread metaphor of divine repentance and incorporate into our theology the reality it depicts, namely that God can change his mind depending on the decisions that human beings make. But, he continues, God's repentance does not necessarily imply a lack of foreknowledge on his part. Well, it seems to me he has a disconnect there. Also in his book, he quotes Bruce Ware as making this statement: just because God knows in advance that some event will occur, this does not preclude God from experiencing appropriate emotions and expressing appropriate reactions when it actually happens. To continue the quotation from Ware, God may experience internally and express outwardly appropriate moral responses to these situations when they occur in history. So the idea he seems to be expressing is that God has knowledge of what's going to happen, but as it actually happens, he experiences it. Now, it seems to me that they're taking away with one hand what they've given with the other for reasons like this. The concession that God's experience is temporal or successive is significant, but it conflicts with the concept of divine foreknowledge that these critics of open theism insist on. If God knows the future exhaustively, as they maintain, then God knows how God will feel in the future, and to know exactly how one will feel is already to have the feeling. In other words, they're making a distinction that just won't wash. God already has the experience. The actual occurrence of the event contributes nothing new to God's experience after all. It cannot. Temporal experience requires an open future. It is not only difficult from our human perspective to conceive of genuine repentance coexisting with exhaustive foreknowledge, it is impossible. If God truly enjoys temporal experience, then God's knowledge of the future cannot be exhaustive.
Excellent. Thanks to you three, and you can have a seat. I'd like to call up Gregory Boyd.